Coffee with Coker is a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape. Welcome back to Coffee with Coker. My name's Mark Reiboldt. I'm the host of the podcast. And joining me today, we have Cordini, who runs Coker's coding and compliance services. And we'll get into that here. And then we have DeAnn Tucker. This is her first time joining us on the podcast. She's a senior manager in Coker's compliance service line. And today we're talking about some specific things that we do within our compliance services that we probably don't talk about enough, but it's one of our fastest growing areas, and we probably get the most of our questions from clients as far as when they are in need. So we'll talk more about compliance today, specifically around HIPAA and security risk assessments. And so, like I said, we'll get into that. Again, I just want to thank everybody for listening. And just a couple of housekeeping items here. Want to remind everybody, you can subscribe to us, follow us, the Coffee with Coker podcast on whatever platform you prefer. You can also find us on social media, LinkedIn, and as well as all of our team members. And along with this episode, you can find all of our episodes on our website. You can find them directly at coffeewithcoker.com. You can find all of Coker's published insights and subject matter expertise at cokergroup.com on the insights page. And so we hope everybody finds that helpful. And in today's discussion, there's a number of pieces that have been written, presentations that our team has done. We'll make sure there's links to those and copies of those available in the show notes. So if we refer to something, obviously we can't get into all the detail here. So there is a lot of supporting reference material out there. We'll make sure that's available to you guys. So with that, let's jump in. Roz and DeAnn, I guess where we should start, it'd be helpful for our listeners. I think it'd be helpful for me just to get into what is an SRA? What do we mean when we're talking about that?
Sure. I'll take that question, Mark. Thank you. It's a great question because a lot of times we'll hear people interchange the SRA for a security risk analysis, or they might call it a security risk assessment. And it really isn't important about what the A stands for. It's really more important about the content of the actual analysis. The requirement to conduct a security risk analysis is found in the security rule at 164.308. And it's defined as an accurate and thorough assessment of the potential risk and vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of electronic patient information. So you can see in the definition why people might mix up what does the A stand for. But really more importantly is what's in the content of the report. The step that's often missed in a security risk analysis is developing a risk rating report where you look at your threats and your vulnerabilities and you identify the risk and you score them as high, medium, or low. The Office for Civil Rights in charge of enforcement issued guidance stating that an SRA is the first step in identifying your threats, your vulnerabilities, and the risk to your ePHI that you might have stored.
So you kind of define what an SRA is from a technical guideline standpoint. How is the assessment done?
Another great question, and another thing that people struggle with. There's really no one way to perform an SRA. There is a lot of great guidance out there, and OCR doesn't specifically identify exactly how to perform one, but they do reference the NIST requirements. So we typically use that as kind of a foundation when we conduct our SRAs, which we'll get into a little bit more in our discussion.
Okay, so I think it's probably pretty clear to everybody the importance of protecting confidential patient health information. I think that, that's probably pretty widely understood, but I would think this is kind of new to a lot of people that such an assessment really needs to be done. It needs to be done regularly. And there's guidelines for it, even though there's not kind of one specific guideline for how to do it or what it should entail. If we're talking about limiting or mitigating risk, that's kind of like a natural progression, particularly, I mean, we're talking hospitals mostly here, hospitals, medical groups, any sort of organization that deals in PHI, I guess. But you talk a little bit more about the importance of this. And again, obviously it's important to protect patient health information, but take that kind of to another level, if you will.
Sure. The first and foremost, most important reason why you want to do a security risk analysis is that it's required by Health and Human Services. And it's required for covered entities and for business associates who have access to ePHI. It's also required for anyone who is participating in the Medicare, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid incentive program. Currently, MIPS, you probably have also heard it referred to as meaningful use.
Right.
So you can see how both of those organizations are requiring it. More importantly, it just helps you identify your risk to the risk to your data, and helps you identify not threats, but weaknesses in your security posture before they're exploited by a criminal. And weaknesses might be the lack of encryption. It may also be the use of out-of-date software and operating systems. So you really want to do an SRA so that you can identify those before criminals do. They are getting very good at figuring out new ways to attack us.
So I would think it's important because we want to identify these weaknesses or potential threats or, any sort of gap that may exist. And I'm sure there are a lot that we probably aren't even aware of that could exist. Right. But also just to cover yourself. I mean, to cover your organization, to have one of these. And if something did happen, again, hopefully you can mitigate as much of that risk as possible. I guess you can never eliminate every single risk or potential risk, but if you do the SRA, not only do you identify, hopefully, some risk, but you're covered as well, at least to a certain extent. I guess we don't want to, it's not an insurance policy, but there is a little bit of that, hey, we are covering ourselves and we're attempting to address any potential issues that may come up.
That's right, Mark. And I would also say it's insurance from the standpoint that if you get exploited and experience a breach and the OCR comes in under an investigation, obviously it's a great fact that you have a copy of your most recent and timely SRA completed and in your files. But it also helps if you have actually worked the remediation plan associated with your SRA. OCR will always ask for at least the past 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 years of your prior SRAs leading up to a breach of information. So it really is just a critical aspect of every covered entity and business associate that has access to ePHI, like DeAnn mentioned.
So Roz, that kind of brings up a good question. What do we recommend as far as when these need to be done, how often, and what does that documentation need to look like on an ongoing basis?
So what's required under the security rule is an annual security risk analysis or update to an existing security risk analysis. And so from there, DeAnn, why don't you jump in and talk about the documentation that you would expect to find in the files?
Sure. So typically, like Roz mentioned, we recommend everyone do an SRA yearly, or at least not just review it and say you've reviewed it, but a really good deep dive into what was your last SRA results, where is your remediation plan, and have you been working your remediation plan ongoing throughout the year? And typically that's a piece that people will forget to do. We do, in our process of doing SRAs, we do provide a kind of a jump start to a remediation plan. We give you a list of items we feel like need to be addressed. and give you a suggestion on maybe where to start. But obviously, the remediation is something that each organization will decide to handle in however they feel like is best for their organization. It is important to do those because, I want to bring back that discussion about, if you have a large breach, you're going to have to produce that for OCR during the investigation. And oftentimes, if you look at previous corrective action plans, you will see that specifically the finding is that the organization failed to conduct an accurate and thorough risk assessment. So it's very important when it comes to your corrective action plan, civil monetary penalties, and what that penalty might be.
So let me ask you then, if I'm one of these organizations, I deal in ePHI and I don't have either an updated SRA or never have done one at all, perhaps, or maybe I did, but I'm not working that remediation plan. I kind of set on the shelf. What happens? What are we dealing with?
Oftentimes, you're looking at probably a higher civil monetary penalty, and probably a more detailed corrective action plan. Typically, the corrective action plans are 3 years, and it's a very detailed process. We have a couple of clients we've helped through that process, and they hold your hand through the entire process for 3 years. So obviously, if you haven't done an SRA ever, or if you've not done one recently, or you're not working your remediation plan and you're not making efforts to improve your security posture, they're going to look at that a little differently than someone who's really tried hard. And unfortunately, the criminals figure out how to get around your security measures.
Yeah, and I think over the years, we've seen a number of examples out there. People can find probably a number of these because they do become public, and they often entail pretty significant monetary penalties and fines, and then obviously there's costs in terms of working out and resolving the issues as well. What are some of the things that you all have seen out there? Again, not our clients necessarily, but cases that have been made public and that are pretty kind of open to the public.
Wow, there are so many different things. One thing that seems to be pretty common, and you would think everyone has addressed by now, but just encrypting data at rest, encrypting data in movement. It could be on a laptop, it could be on a desktop, your mobile devices. And, it's been referenced in corrective action plans in the past as no longer seen as optional, but really should be more of a requirement. The security rule says it's addressable for every organization, and it's not listed as required. So people will sometimes misinterpret that. But really, you should take a really deep dive into, is encryption important for us? Does it lessen our risk if a laptop is stolen? Or if someone breaks into our office and steals our equipment? So that's one of the big things that you see mentioned in corrective action plans is the lack of encryption. I've seen corrective action plans where organizations have had a laptop stolen, and their corrective action, their civil monetary penalty is low because of all the work they were doing to try and limit or lessen that risk if a laptop's stolen. However, I've seen other organizations have the same incident, and their civil monetary penalty is much higher because of their failure to address issues identified in their security risk analysis, and failed to do them or at least review them annually.
So they do take into consideration kind of the intent and effort, not just the intent, I should say, but the effort that was actually invested into. Because I feel like, and for years, I feel like you hear a story every pretty often, but an employee had a laptop. That laptop had access to certain files and data, and it was stolen out of the back of the car or something like that, and or things like that. Is that kind of the typical thing, or are we talking very sophisticated, phishing type breaches and criminal organizations trying to obtain information that can lead to taking people's identities? I mean, what is the kind of typical thing, or is it everything?
It's everything.
Yeah.
It's everything.
You can see a lot of different types of incidents.
Yeah.
And another thing besides encryption that I think is important is the lack of policies in place. Not only written policies, security policies, but actually making those policies specific to your organization. Not a lot of times, in addition to requests for copies of your SRA, the OCR will also ask for copies of your security policies and what was in place prior to the breach, what's in place now, et cetera. And something that's not a good situation to be in for an organization is to have a policy template or manual in place that really is templated, that has blanks in it, has fill-ins that have never been completed, and more importantly, has never been customized to the organization. So the policies say, in order to address some of the security issues or standards in the security role, we're going to do A, B, and C, but in fact, they haven't implemented them in that way. So it just kind of reemphasizes that remediation plan when it includes security policy development that needs to be present in order to meet those standards, to make sure that you are working through that. It's probably one of the lower hanging fruit items you can take care of early. That's really going to help you as things happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, there's so much here, again, as I said earlier, that I know I don't think there's a organization out there in the healthcare services world that doesn't realize that, risk mitigation in this area is a thing, and that it's important. But there's just so much more to this when you get into all the detail, which again, we don't have time to get into all of it today, but there's a lot out there on it, but there's so much more to it that I think that's on the surface of just simply needing to protect information, which is why I think this is very helpful. Talk a little bit now, if you don't mind, about what we do in this area and kind of our process, because I think that would be helpful for our listeners, and to not just know that, hey, this is important, but also, hey, here's what's typically entailed, at least from a high level.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. Our process starts with simply a kickoff call. We will have the key stakeholders on the phone. We walk through the process with them and what's next. From there, we give them a request for information. We tailor that for the client, but typically we ask for an asset inventory list, which is key to knowing where your risks are, is knowing where your information is. So we'll ask for an asset inventory list, including any BYOD devices and corporate owned. We'll ask for a description of the network, or even a network diagram that helps us understand data flow and what data they might have on premise versus in the cloud. We will ask for a copy of their policies and procedures, and we will also ask for a list of applications that they use that store, transmit, receive ePHI. Additionally, we'll ask them for a list of their business associates. Some people will also send us examples because they're interested in how well are their business associate agreements written and implemented. So we'll review those for them, and then we'll also review their template if they're interested in us reviewing their template. And most people really would like to know how well is our template doing, and are there any recommended or required things that need to be put in their template. After we review all the documentation, we typically get on the phone with, again, key stakeholders to clarify anything we might have seen in the policies and procedures, or maybe assets, things that might pop up, or flags that I might want to dig into a little bit more. I'll do key stakeholder interviews. Typically, we'll also talk with their IT group. Some people have managed service providers. Some people have IT in-house. And then from there, we'll also at the same time start to kick off the vulnerability scan that we do. The vulnerability scan, I like to call it, the trust but verify, because things always slip through the crack. Again, let's talk about the encryption on the laptop. You may have a policy that says you're going to encrypt laptops. You may have a process in place where any new laptop going out gets encrypted, but maybe one slips through the crack and you don't even know it. So we will try to help you find those one-offs, things that kind of slip through the cracks, and help you identify those so you can address them. In the vulnerability scan, we also look for things like virus protection software. It is so important for people to not only implement virus protection software, but to keep those the virus definitions up to date, because new viruses come out every day. And then we'll look for, in the vulnerability scan, we'll look for out-of-date operating systems. So again, there's one laptop somewhere somebody's using that you've forgotten about that may have Windows 7 on it. Huge risk right there. So we'll help you identify things that might have slipped through the cracks. After we do that, we produce draft reports. We review the draft reports with our client to make sure there's not anything I've misunderstood, or that maybe they need more additional information about that they might want me to include in the final report. After I do that, I go through creating an executive summary, which is typically a high-level document that is shared with your board, any privacy and security committees that you may have, senior leadership. You could also share that with anyone who requests a copy of your last SRA. It's a little more concise, whereas I also produce a detailed summary, which really digs into the weeds of everything and how things are scored and why they were scored that way. And typically your security officer or whoever's responsible for your remediation plan is going to look at that document and really get deeper into the weeds. Then we also provide policies and procedures if needed. Some organizations have great copies of their policies and procedures and may just need one policy. So I may include a sample of one particular policy that maybe they forgot to include in their manual. We also include supporting documentations. The vulnerability scan information will include, and we'll also include any print screens that we might have captured while we were doing the vulnerability scan, or other resources. Some organizations don't realize they may have a risk and ask me to do a little research and give them a little kind of kickstart on their remediation plan. So I'll provide them with some helpful documentation.
So not a very comprehensive and not a one and done type thing, usually, meaning you have your SRA, and hopefully each year you may not have to go through the same level of rigor that you did on the original, but obviously you're still covering a lot of these things through the vulnerability scan and documentation review and policies and procedure development, all of that.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to mention, we may have clients where we do their second SRA. And, obviously I've looked at their policies during the first SRA, but I'm going to look at them again during the second SRA because new best practices may have come out. Maybe they've made changes or additions to their policies that I will want to review and maybe provide feedback. So it's great. It's great to look at your policies every year. Mm-hmm. And so we'll do that for them during the SRA process.
So the last question I have, I think will be helpful for folks listening. When working with our clients, is there a typical scenario where we get involved? Meaning, is it are we typically coming in on this kind of front end before there's a breach or before there are issues and trying to get ahead of it, more preventative risk mitigation or risk identification, and then, kind of work an action plan? Or are we typically coming in and there's something has been identified, there's an issue, there's a breach, whatever it may be? Or is it all of the above?
It's really all of the above. And the preferred time to come in is proactively because it's required by the law, because it's good practice. But we get called in, we get engaged as the HIPAA expert as part of corrective action plans when we have clients who are under corrective action plans with HHS because of a breach. They may be required to pull a HIPAA expert in, and DeAnn serves as that expert, guiding them through policy development, SRA completion, things like that. So we do it in all circumstances, but we much prefer to get in there proactively and help these companies and covered entities and business associates just get their best practices in place before it even becomes an issue.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And
one thing I was going to add is, we have clients who have been in business for years, and we'll help them with their SRA and the development or improvement of their processes and policies. But we also have clients who are brand new and just starting out, and contact us and say, our business is developing in an area where we might have some exposure as a business associate, and we may or may not move forward and offer services that require us to access, store, transmit ePHI, and we understand our requirement is to be HIPAA compliant, and we want to get ahead of this. And so we also have clients that come to us with the idea of growth and understanding that they need to know what HIPAA is now. And we'll do training for those people. Sometimes we have people come to us who don't really know anything about HIPAA, and they'll come and ask us to do some education with them.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I know with all of the transactions going on out there and kind of new parties getting more deeper into owning healthcare services businesses, the compliance requirements are a new world for a lot of these folks. Or maybe there's a change of ownership and there's a due diligence element to this. But I think that's probably one of the things that a lot of people may not know of or be aware of, is how many new organizations are out there. And again, they may be consolidating or something like that, but there's a lot of this there are a lot of ways that something like this could slip through the cracks, I would think.
Well, it's a good point, Mark. And just I'll say, when organizations are acquiring new practices during the course of a year, those are absolute opportunities to update your security risk analysis along the way. So if you're adding a new practice, a new healthcare organization, to go ahead and update your security risk analysis at that time, especially it doesn't matter if it's a large or small practice that's being acquired, because the risk can be huge with the small practice, just as they could with a large one. But just keeping in mind, as you're changing services, adding services, it's important to step back and look at how that affects your risk profile. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the other piece here, I think, is that we should mention is we're talking about electronic information to a large or mostly here to a large degree. And so there's a technology aspect to this, I think. And that's one of the things I think is unique about Coker, in that we not only have compliance experts, as you two ladies are representing, but there's a technology piece here that sometimes, again, it may be a way that stuff can slip through the cracks if somebody's not covering. Technology side thinks that the compliance folks are covering, and compliance folks are deferring to the technology experts, and we may find that it's something is missing or not happening. Is that pretty common?
Are you referring to common happening inside an organization where one person might think the other person's
Right,
taking care of something. And it can happen. I think when you have one particular person whose main responsibility is overall compliance with HIPAA, and specifically privacy and security and breach notification rules, all three, then it becomes a little easier. But many times organizations have people in those roles that wear multiple hats.
Yeah.
You might see someone over that and also serving as their corporate compliance officer, or you may see someone also specifically around privacy. They may be also the privacy officer and the HIM director. So when those people are wearing multiple hats, things do drop, do slip through the cracks. Even when you have somebody that's their primary responsibility might be HIPAA. It's just healthcare is busy, it's ever changing, and it is very hard to keep up sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point because, I think a lot of organizations, particularly right now, are finding themselves in that situation, not just with HIPAA security, but just, like you said, people wearing multiple hats, people changing, moving in and out of different positions, et cetera. So I have to think there's stuff slipping through the cracks more and more. And it is hard to keep up with everything that's new. So, well, this has been very helpful. Again, we were only able to graze the surface as far as what, how much we could really get into if we had the time. But I do appreciate you, spending a few minutes talking about this. And as I said, we have a lot of other information that we've written, white papers and different articles and presentations that are out there, as well as outside external links where people can learn more about some of the corrective action programs that have occurred and learn more about even some of the stuff organizations have had to go through in dealing with some of these issues. So I appreciate you guys talking about this. And I know this is something we'll talk more about as it continues to develop and evolve. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback. And we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.